Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Chernihiv and Sumy area. According to the Russians, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost up to 20 soldiers on this direction. Since the creation of this front line in April of 2022, the Russians managed to destroy up to 1,500 Ukrainian soldiers and managed to destroy up to 200 of armored vehicles, just as a result of work of reconnaissance and sabotage groups. Now we are moving to Kharkiv direction. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians reported that the Russians are planning to start the creation of buffer zone operation within the next week or two. As we discussed, the Russians have just window of opportunity for another 3 or 4 weeks for any offensive operation all over the entire line of combat contact, and after that the bad weather is going to come and the conditions will not allow the Russians to conduct any full-scale offensive operation anywhere. So that's why, but before starting any operation, any buffer zone operation, the Russians still have a lot of job to do. For example, somewhere in Sumy area the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian D-20 howitzer, and as a result of counter-artillery duel, that D-20 howitzer of the Ukrainian armed forces was destroyed. When talking about Kharkiv area, the Russians destroy and damage attack Liptsi. On this video, for example, we see how the Russians destroyed another barrack in this area, and this is very interesting why the Russians are so focused on Liptsi. The thing is that, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Ukrainians attacked Il-76 with Ukrainian prisoners of war from this city, from the vicinity of this city, using probably Patriot system. And as I understand, the Russians managed to discover that Ukrainians haven't managed to evacuate the US Patriot system. Probably they managed to hide that Patriot system in one of the hangars in this area, barracks of this area, and now the Russians are bombing this territory heavily, trying to get the US Patriot system. If we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of the week, the previous strikes took place somewhere on the 25th of January, and the Russians were doing the same. They were hunting the US Patriot system in the village by the name of Liptsi. Currently, according to the Ministry of Defense, we haven't received any report whether the Russians managed to destroy that city, to find, locate and destroy it or not. Now we are moving further. According to information we have, the Ukrainians announced about massive evacuation from the villages and cities along the border. The Ukrainians are planning to evacuate the village by the name of Udy, the village by the name of Liptsi, and the village by the name of Vovchansk. As I understand, this is also a part of or attempt from the Ukrainian side to evacuate Patriot system and to cover this evacuation program. This evacuation is, say, a special operation under the cover of evacuated civilians. So you know that they're trying to stretch the Russian attention to Udy, Liptsi and Vovchansk, and using civilian evacuation, probably they want to evacuate the Patriot system and the personnel as well. So very interesting, we'll follow the situation. Obviously the Russians will not allow the Ukrainians to evacuate the Patriot system. Now we are moving to Kupiansk direction. We continue receiving significant updates from this territory. According to information we have, the Ukrainians have already started preparation of the Kupiansk front line, the Kupiansk, the city itself. The Ukrainians start mining and the crossings across Oskol. In the right bank part of Kupiansk, firing points are being installed on the roofs of high-rise buildings. So the Ukrainians are getting ready, are trying to get ready to meet the Russians in the village, in the city of Kupiansk. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainians started redeployment of medical centers, headquarters, logistic groups, support groups from Kupiansk as well. Very interesting details and updates we're receiving from Sinkovka. According to some Russian sources, the Ukrainian sources, the Russians entered Sinkovka during the previous 24 hours in the northern part and managed to establish this more or less stable foothold in this area. So that's according to some Ukrainians, the Russians entered once again Sinkovka. Furthermore, we got the video, geolocated video of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians in the northern part, and we got very interesting video published by the Ukrainians, 60th Mechanized Brigade of Ukrainian counterattack against the Russian positions in the forest between Liman Perv and Sinkovka. On this video, we can see a pair of Ukrainian tanks who were bombing and attacking the Russian positions along the edge position of the forest within a distance of maybe 10 or 20 meters. So, as we can see, the Russians managed to got as close as possible to Sinkovka, not from the north, but also the Russians are trying to bypass this area, let's say to bypass Sinkovka from the west and to get to the southern part of the village. Once again, this video shows the Ukrainian tanks. There are two geolocations, both of them related to this video, and we see, let's say, how deep the Ukrainians managed to get, so not very far inside of the forest, just on the edge positions. And according to this geolocation, as I understand, during the previous 24 hours, during the previous weeks of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their positions on Sinkovka direction and to establish control over this part of the forest. If it's and this is like confirmed, geo-confirmed, and if the Russians have this progress, obviously I have a lot of questions about the status of this territory, of the forest between Liman Первый and Sinkovka. Very likely that this territory is also under Russian control, yet we haven't received even a single geolocated video confirming the Russian progress, but we neither had any Ukrainian geolocation or something like this. Very likely this territory is under Russian. Furthermore, as we can see, the Russians are trying to increase the length of half encirclement of Sinkovka. As I understand, they want to establish control along this red line, which will increase the chances of the Russian forces to capture Sinkovka. And for these purposes, of course, the Russians will continue their offensive operation, and for these purposes they need to establish at least something like this within the next few weeks, or of course it's better to speed up the operation and to capture this territory maybe for the next bit, for 2 or 3 weeks. They don't have more time when talking about the Russians. You having this progress, of course, it will ease their offensive operation in Sinkovka, because they will be able to attack using the broad front line tactics. Now we are moving to probably the most important and the most media loud frontline and area, to Kislovka-Kotlerovka. I'll remind you that during the previous week, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over the village by the name of Krakhmalne. This event took place the previous week. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of the month, we're gonna see the number of updates, lots of icons, lots of let's say flags, lots of let's say bombings, lots of explosions, and so on. So let's start discussion this frontline once again since the beginning for better understanding. First update we got today somewhere at 7 a.m. of the local time. On this video we see how the Russian FPV drone attacked the positions and the truck or car of FPV drone operators from the Ukrainian side. As a result of that attack, the Ukrainian FPV drone operators lost probably 1 unit. After that, we got the video of heavy Russian bombing of the villages of Tabaivka and the village of Peshchane. On this video we see FAB 500, FABs 500, FAB 1500, and after very heavy aviation strikes, aviation preparation, the Russians launched their ground operation, the ground offensive, ground assault. And as a result of attack, the Russians at first managed to establish control over Tabaivka itself. This is Tabaivka, and according to different mappers, different pro-Russian mappers, we have some updates. Most of them have already updated their map showing the schema of Russian attack, so this is approximately a Russian area of control. Other sources reported, very more or less reliable sources, Russian sources, reports about this progress. And right before I start making this video, Russian sources reported that Ukrainians either confirmed the control of this territory by the Russians. So this is like, there is no doubts that the Russians established complete control over this territory and that Ukrainians were forced to step back. So this is the situation in the area. Very likely the Ukrainians retreated towards Peshchane. So because this is the only position, the only possible area where Ukrainians could withdraw. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the day, the Russians were trying to attack Kotlerovka also along N26 road, and first somewhere at 11 a.m. of the local time, we got reports that there were very heavy clashes on the outskirts of the village. And also right before I start making the video, and during the day, we got few more updates from this territory, and the most important one is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Kotlerovka. So this is additional Russian progress in this area. For now, neither the Tabaivka nor Kotlerovka progress of the Russian forces was geo-confirmed. It's just the messages in Telegram channels, but from very reliable sources. We need to wait more. And also, before I start making the video, we got update that there were very heavy clashes in Kislovka as well. So as I understand, the Ukrainians start withdrawing their positions. They're not going to fight for these territories, because just yesterday we were talking about the Russian attack in direction of Ivanovka, and very likely that Ivanovka also was captured by the Russians, or Ivanovka is about to be captured by the Russians, which forced the Ukrainians to make a decision to withdraw their positions from Kislovka Kotlarovka, first in direction of the intersection of railways and the road N26 in this area. This is the next, let's say, logistic hub, logistic territory of the Ukrainian forces, and after that the Ukrainians obviously will withdraw further in direction of Pishana. Why is that? First of all, I haven't managed to add the fortification and strongholds on this area, but before tomorrow's video I will do this. The Ukrainians have few defense belt in this area, and the most important and the most powerful defense belt of Ukrainian forces goes something like this. So there are few lines of trenches. All of these trenches are connected between each other. So, and that's why the Ukrainians now took a decision to withdraw to this line, to this Pishana, and probably from the southern Pishana they will move further to Kolesnikovka. When talking about, let's say, the area between Kislovka, Kotlarovka, Stepovo, Novoselok, when talking about these fields, there are probably 5 strongholds. So this area, the Ukrainians haven't managed to create defense belt in these fields. So there are no place to evacuate and no place to run. And the Ukrainians will be forced to move almost till Oskol River and at least to Pishana. So that's why all these fields, all these areas will be captured by the Russians within the next weeks. Of course, they are completely mined. The Russians will be forced to pay time to demine. But anyway, after the fall of Kislovka, Kotlarovka, Tabaivka, Stepovo, Novoselovka, we can say that the battle for Oskol will begin, because it's the next thing is the battle for regarding the distance, regarding, let's say, the distance from Glushevka and Tabaivka. Let's say there is like around 10 kilometers. There are no defense fortification from the Ukrainian side. So this is the reason I'm saying that after the fall of this area, the Russians will be able to bypass without almost any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Just minefields maybe, or something like this. We will add a fortification tomorrow and you will understand what I'm talking about. Of course, this is significant progress from the Russian side, and all these updates about the preparation of Kupiansk and all these things is correlate completely with the situation. And another thing, the Russians, if I just read very interesting article, the main purpose of the Russians in this area is not to capture villages. There is no goal from the Russian side to capture villages. The most important part and goal from the Russian side is to establish control over big city, big stronghold like Bakhmut. And there is just one city like Bakhmut, and we're talking about Kupiansk. The Russians need this area. The Russians need the railways. They need to connect. They need more something very big in front of Kharkiv, because from villages like I don't know, Stepovo, Novoselok, Stelmakhovka, no chances to conduct any offensive operation in Kharkiv. To attack Kharkiv, the Russians need a very powerful stronghold and very big city with railway connections with the mainland, and there is just one city like that, and this is Kupiansk. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Liman area, where the Russians also continue their offensive operation. Very likely within the next 48 hours we're going to receive more updates, or first updates, of how the Russians entered Makeyevka itself, because the clashes and artillery duels are taking place right in front of the first streets and buildings of this village. When talking about Terny, we don't have any updates. The Russians are trying to dig in deeper, maybe to conduct some operations to answer the tree lines. The only video we have is how the Ukrainian FPV drones were attacking the Russian armored vehicles in this direction. As a result of another FPV drone strike, the Russians lost another tank. Nothing special, just a regular military routine. When talking about Liman direction, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt, and the Russians continue their offensive operation in Kremenaya forest, and the distance between, let's say, the Russian Russian positions, and let's say these positions of a very difficult terrain and the ground is around 1 kilometer. The Russians continue their offensive operation. They're bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces. We have some videos with assaults, and very likely that soon we're going to receive update that as a result of another Russian offensive operation, they managed to establish control over this territory. And when it happens, the Russians will open the gates and open the window of opportunity to attack the village by the name of Grigorovka from behind, and to cut supply and support of Ukrainian forces in this area, and to force them to step back further to the west in direction of Serebryanka, Dronovka and Yampol. When talking about Bilogorovka, according to some sources, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and to enter Bilogorovka itself along Oktyabrskaya street. So some buildings, first buildings along this street was captured by the Russians. Yet we haven't received any geolocated video confirmations, but probably something like this is happening right now. Furthermore, the Russians continue their storming operation on the western part, and they also try to enter the village. But all these updates, all these advances is not so important. They are very important, but we understand that the main Ukrainian positions are located on Bilogorovka hill. So this is the reason why the Russians try to attack here. They want to attack the Bilogorovka Ukrainian garrison of 81st Air Mobile Brigade from the behind, and also they want to force the Ukrainians basically to step back due to the risk of being encircled by the Russian attack from behind. The Russians don't have any chances to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt from the west or from the north, from the east or northeast or southeast, because they will be destroyed without any problems from the Ukrainian side. Bilogorovka hills are located on the very, very big, let's say, height in comparison with the Russian position. So the only option for the Russians is to attack from behind. When talking about Siversk direction, we have few updates of Russian bombings, some artillery preparation before further offensive operation. Bogdanovka area. The Russians continue storming operation of the main Ukrainian defense belt between Bogdanovka, Popovo forest. As you can see, there are around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 defense strongholds in this area, very powerful strongholds, and yet the Russians haven't managed to establish control even over a single one. And the Russians are trying to penetrate this defense belt since the beginning of probably the second half of December. They dealt significant damage to the Ukrainian forces in this area, but yet they haven't started even a single ground operation. And we understand why, because this area is too powerful. There are too many strongholds for the Russians. They need to create some plan. They need to find a way how to bypass these strongholds and to get as close as possible to Canal and to bypass Popovo forest. Furthermore, we got a video how the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian FPV drone position on the eastern part of Canal, and as a result of FPV drone strike, the Ukrainians lost another unit of FPV drones. No updates from Bogdanovka, as you can see, and some updates from Grigorovka. The Russians continue bombing the village with artillery, with FPV drones, so it's something like another possible direction of Russian movement. First, they need to destroy the Ukrainian positions, and after that, we might see the ground operation in this area, but also not very soon because of lots of strongholds and fortifications. We haven't received anything during the previous 24 hours from Ivanovskaya area. As we discussed, the last update we have is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, entered the outskirts of the village, for now without any geolocated proofs. The only video we have is how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian rotation process, and after the Russians, as you can see, were following that rotation, another Bradley or some personnel carrier arrived. The Ukrainians tried to replace the forces, but the Russians started bombing them exactly in the moment when they were replacing them. The Ukrainians had significant losses and the rotation failed. The Ukrainians haven't managed to bring fresh forces and haven't managed to move let's say, old forces or something like this. All these geolocations tell us that very likely, due to the problems with the personnel, the Russians very soon will try to attack in this direction as well. And the main purpose of the Russians in this case is to maintain the combat line, to shorten the let's say, the positions, to capture all these territories, and to connect let's say, to improve their positions in the vicinity to 115.7 hill. This attack can cut the Ukrainian defense belt in two parts and basically collapse logistic, and which will lead to collapse the entire defense belt in Klishevka and the western fortification of this area. Now we are moving to Avdiivka. We haven't received anything from the northern flank, but we got another Russian offensive operation from the north in direction of the eastern part of Avdiivka. This video was published by the 110th Mechanized Brigade. On this video we see another Russian convoy attacking the Ukrainian positions. This video was published by the Ukrainians once again. It's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians managed to achieve, but according to geolocations, the Russians were moving something like this. And they attacked these three lines. So just based on this geolocation, we have the right to correct the map and to show this territory under complete Russian control. We will adjust the map before the next video. No updates from the southern part. Probably the Russians are trying to dig in deeper. The Ukrainians made few counterattacks. They managed to stabilize the situation, but not for a very long period of time, as I understand. Very soon the Russians will renew their offensive. Interesting updates are coming from Pervomaiska. According to information we have, the Russians by the morning of the local time of 27th of January managed to establish control over this part of Pervomaiska, and right before I start making this video, the Russians reported that as a result of offensive operation they managed to bypass significant territories and to establish control over this part of Pervomaiska. So the Russians entered the intersection of Pershatravneva Street and the street of Voroshilova Street. So this is it. This is the territory. The Russians, as a result of these gains, managed to get the operational space, and now they can move not just along the village itself, but to move in direction of the main stronghold of the Ukrainians between Pervomaiska and Nivolska. We haven't received anything from Krasnogorovka, Marinka, Novomikhailovka, nothing new, but we got a lot of very interesting updates from, let's say, Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were using the ground drone. On this video we can see the new Ukrainian tactics. The Russians also have these ground drones, but the Russians are using them for, let's say, evacuation purposes of wounded soldiers. The Russians are use this drone for, let's say, sending some food, supplies, support, ammo, very heavy ammo, let's say, and so on. But the Ukrainians were using this type of weapon for moving the bomb, and they established this drone below the bridge that goes from to Novodonetsk, and as a result of explosion that bridge was damaged and destroyed. I can't say that the Ukrainians managed to collapse the logistic between Novodonetsk and Kremenchuk during the winter period of time, but of course this is unpleasant situation for the Russians. Now we are moving to Rabotino area. The Russians started the ground operation and final storm of Rabotino itself. Today the Russians were using a significant number of infantry and armored vehicles, personnel carriers, and the Russians were trying to get Rabotino from the southwestern direction. We don't have any updates regarding the results of that attack. The only thing we have is some updaters on the Russian maps, and we have some videos of Ukrainians with FPV drone strikes. We will not watch the videos due to losses from the Russian side and very cruel videos, but anyway, as a result of that attack, at least the Russians managed to establish control over something like this, and now they're about to enter Rabotino itself. Maybe they have already done this. Now we are moving further to Kherson direction. The Russians continue bombing of the villages and cities along Dnipro River heavily with FAPs. During the previous 24 hours we got another batch of videos of FAPs, 1,500 and 500. Lots of Ukrainian positions were destroyed, temporary positions, artillery positions, and so on. As I understand, the Russians started preparation, this foothold, before the spring military campaign. You know that the Ukrainians were forced to step back from the most part of Krynki, but the important thing that Ukrainians haven't left the islands in the vicinity of Krynki. And now the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to send more forces to the islands, but neither the Russians have possibilities to force the Ukrainians to step back. And as I understand, the Russians will establish complete control over the Krynki, or at least this is going to be a dead zone without anyone inside. But when spring comes, the Ukrainians will have positions among the islands, and obviously the Ukrainians will renew their attempts to cross the river. So that's why the Russians renewed their bombings along the river, trying to discover and destroy Ukrainian position and concentration of forces of 35th, 37th, 36th, and 38 brigades. So the Ukrainians probably will try to make more in this direction, but obviously all these attempts will be useless. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.